Kia ora koutou, ina koutou katoa. Now mai haole mai. Welcome to the fourth subsection of the day. No Malaysia Rawan no China oku tupuna ko kautan toku ingoa. I'm a research fellow for the Working to End Racial Oppression or WIRO research program, and I have the privilege to be the chair section for this section. In the next hour, we'll hear from four amazing presenters discussing being Pākehā and Pākehā allyship in the format of Pecha Kucha. If people are not familiar with the format of the Pecha Kucha, each presenter is allocated about 7 minutes, or to be precise, 6 minutes and 40 seconds, where they will discuss their research and mahi in 20 slides. Presenters have been encouraged to spend no more than 20 seconds on each slide, and there will be a reminder when they reach their 6-minute marks. The focus on this section is being Pākehā and Pākehā allyships. So as the majority group in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pākehā collectively hold privilege that are important to unpack. To be a Pākehā ally is to be a shield for the oppressed, and to know, accept, and understand that although you did not choose your Pākehā identity, it gives you special power in Aotearoa that Maori and people of color will have difficulties accessing. The first presenter today who will help us to unpack this is Nairi, who's a friend of mine as well. She identifies as a Pākehā and Tangata Tiriti and is a full-time PhD student at AUT. She currently lives in Whangarei and is a member of Network Waitangi, Whangarei, and STIR. Her presentation topic is fertility-based anti-racism of Pākehā allies, where she will share initial findings from a study exploring fertility-based anti-racism practice of Pākehā allies during Aotearoa health system reform. I'll now pass the microphone to Nairi to kick us off.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Nairi Ray taku ingoa, he Pākehā aho, he tangata tiriti aho. I'm speaking to you from the whenua of Ngāti Hau, me ngā Puhinui tonu, and my topic is exploring treaty-based anti-racism of Pākehā allies during the reform of the Aotearoa health system. So my PhD is based on a novel treaty-based methodology, which core to this is a critical research whānau of Māori and Pākehā who provided strategic and political advice throughout, including involvement in selection and ultimately endorsement of the 7 participants as allies. And I'm really just going to talk to you briefly about the findings, and I've got 4 kind of overarching or layering themes. System change that influences politics, power, people, and performativity. The next layer is about Pākehā positionality that informs anti-racism action, and ultimately treaty-based anti-racism, which is a unique praxis to here in Aotearoa that builds upon and is supported by the other layers. So this is the first theme from that first overarching layer. Is a no-brainer really. Politics always impacts. We're particularly seeing this play out devastatingly and spectacularly over the last couple of weeks. And this theme speaks to how health is political, how the agenda, the policy, and the racism within our politics impacts on what can be achieved within health system change. The reforms consolidated power for those that had it, particularly the centralisation of DHBs and the absence of any meaningful change to primary health. But importantly, Te Ako Whaiora, the only ray of hope throughout the health system transformation, was noted to have shifted power somewhat and created a more permissive environment for pro-equity and pro-tiriti approaches. This theme talks about the influence that people have on changing systems, but also how the system can change people. So the policies, the practices, the system itself, often people develop workarounds that go against policy. And although this works in the moment, it doesn't shift the system. Leadership is required for lasting system and cultural change. And performativity, the idea that a lot of what we do is a show or a performance. It's not real. A classic example is including words about te tiriti and equity and anti-racism. And yes, we need the words there, but often it's just rhetoric and the words need to be turned into actions. This next overarching theme is about Pākehā positionality, which is constituted by a strong Pākehā cultural identity that's shaped in contact and connection with Te Ao Māori, accountable for Pākehā power and privilege, and acknowledges how we have benefited from racism and colonisation. So Pākehā cultural identity was treaty honouring, recognising Māori sovereignty over Aotearoa, an awareness of Pākehā cultural dominance, racism and colonialism, which required cultural humility. Allyship particularly was a fragile, complex and contested term, and although participants were happy to be bestowed this by Māori, it wasn't an identity that people would claim. Everyone talked about the importance of connection and contact with Te Ao Māori, particularly kaumātua mentors and colleagues, and how this contributed to their Pākehā cultural identity. The importance of forming safe and trusted working relationships, learning from, not about, and accepting the diversity of Māori, not one Māori view. The particular Pākehā positionality described here was clear about accepting and taking accountability for the positions of power and privilege that Pākehā hold because of colonisation and racism, and because of this we are required to act, otherwise we are complicit in the racism. So this overarching theme of anti-racism praxis, which is perhaps unsurprisingly made up of tactical action that is of service and informed by a critically reflective journey. I love the agency and the urgency in this quote. You've got to find racism and you've got to do something about it. Anti-racism is a verb, Heather? So tactical action, participants shared the nuances and considerations of what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and the potential impact of their actions for themselves and others. But anti-racism action is always tactical, strategic, considered, and sometimes it involves compromises. Being of service, this was a really strong theme about being of service, being useful, having skills and knowledge to contribute to the cause, but not making it about yourself. That it provided an alternate response to white saviour, which feeds ego, is to be in service, responding from a place of cultural humility, not wanting to be seen as exceptional, but being useful. Anti-racism praxis is developed in critical reflection with others. It's a journey of self-development where mistakes are made, but you learn from them. It's a journey for life. Honest relationships, again, are crucial to critical reflection and development. And finally, Te Tiriti-based anti-racism praxis is the final layer of the previous layers, and it's what's unique to us here in Aotearoa. Te Tiriti-based anti-racism practices honours Te Tiriti, respects rangatiratanga, and is conducted in relation with Māori. Unsurprisingly, this is about enacting Te Tiriti, directly referencing the Māori text, using articles to guide action, and also about having clarity between equity and Te Tiriti and not conflating or confusing them. And respect for rangatiratanga means action is taken within a Māori agenda, working with Māori leadership and in turn being supported by Māori leadership. Working out what you can do within your role to support rangatiratanga, which includes stepping up, but also stepping out. And finally, you have to be an ally to something or someone. You can't just be an ally to yourself. This is a particular response to Pākehā paralysis. We can act without being a burden to Māori, having reassurance about knowing who we are in relationship with, and whose agenda we are serving. And finally, this is my attempt to sum up treaty-based anti-racism praxis. It's a Pākehā positionality based on a clearly articulated cultural identity formed and maintained in relation with Māori, and accountable for Pākehā power and privilege that recognised ourselves as beneficiaries of racism and colonisation. This positioning informed an anti-racism praxis based on tactical action, purposeful in its intent to be of service to improving Māori health, developed through a critically reflective journey. This culminates in treaty-based anti-racism praxis that upholds the intent of Te Tiriti, enacts the articles, respects Te Rangatiratanga, and is conducted in relation with Māori. Kia ora.
Thank you, Nari, for the amazing presentation and laying out a call for action for our Pākehā allies. Our second presenter is Romy, who identifies as a white South African immigrant and is a first-year PhD student at the University of Auckland, researching on how Pākehā talk about fertility, co-governance, and Maori sovereignty. Her presentation is on the visualization of Angela Ballara's Proud to be White book. Over to you, Romy.
Thank you. Kia ora, my name is Romy. I am a white Tauiwi immigrant from South Africa, and my talk today will be about the ideas and discourses that enabled colonization and the Crown's claim to sovereignty in Aotearoa. Before I begin, I would like to highlight that there are a lot of similarities between what I talk about and Ani Makairi's talk last Saturday on colonization, racism, and the logic of genocide, so I highly recommend watching or listening to Ani's talk too. Firstly, a quote by Moana Jackson that summarizes my talk, which is that colonialism masks its crimes behind semantics. But before we get into the semantics and discourses of colonization, I want to first start with discussing 3 ideas from the Enlightenment that informed these discourses. These are the great chain of being, the doctrine of discovery, and ideas around private property. These 3 ideas emerged around the time of the Enlightenment and were instrumental in fueling colonization. The philosophical idea of the great chain of being centers the world around humans. It is a hierarchy of all life on earth, with God at the top, followed by royalty, aristocracy, civilized Europeans, and then a racial hierarchy down to human savages, with animals and plant life below humans. Secondly, in 1493, a papal bull was issued called the Doctrine of Discovery that created a law that stated that those that discovered a new land would be able to declare sovereignty over those lands. As a result, colonizers felt justified to not only claim sovereignty over another nation's land, but then set up their own laws, systems, and institutions in another nation's country. And finally, regarding private property rights, John Locke was an English philosopher from the 17th century whose ideas influenced Western concepts of land and property. Locke believed that a person's right to land depended on them cultivating that land and creating wealth from that land, and that it was the state's responsibility to protect that right. This argument also claimed that if land was seen as in a state of nature, then it was considered terra nullius and Indigenous people could not claim rights to it. Finding new ways to create wealth was a primary driver of colonization, and these ideas provided colonizers with the legal and moral justification for colonization. And as such, Europeans that arrived in Aotearoa as colonizers and settlers in the 18th and 19th century arrived with these ideas of European superiority and felt justified in taking and claiming another nation's land. So when Hobson declared sovereignty over Aotearoa in May 1840, it was claimed through supposed cessation of sovereignty in signing Te Tiriti in the North Island and by way of the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius in the South Island. So here's where Angela Bellara's book called Proud to be White comes in. Bellara describes a history of European discourses from the arrival of the missionaries up until the 1980s. While there are many other historians and researchers out there in this field, due to the condensed timeline nature of the book, there were 2 overall impressions that I wanted to share. Firstly, most of the discourses detailed by Bellara came from a base belief in European superiority and would oversimplify or ignore history or serve to divorce Europeans from any association or implication in the outcomes that Māori were experiencing. As an example, it was clear by the end of the 19th century that Māori had experienced depopulation, or in less euphemistic terms, genocide. Some of the discourses explaining this in European circles were to blame Māori themselves, such as blaming tribal warfare, degeneration, idleness, or simply that they had come in contact with a superior race. Given the long history of colonization beginning in the Americas in 1492, it was well documented that Indigenous people were likely to die following European arrival. And yet the explanation from European perspective was to blame Māori, rather than examine the impact of European arrival, the introduced diseases, the land alienation, the marginalization, and the complete disregard and destruction of Te Ao Māori. Secondly, Bellara's book leaves an image of shifting and expanding discourses that serve to support an accumulation of benefits to European settlers, with the flip side that these discourses also serve to increase harm, alienation, and marginalization for Māori. For example, in talking about freeing Māori from idleness and communism in legislating for individual land titles, in justifying the land wars as suppressing Māori rebellion. Fast forward to the early 20th century, where there is informal racial segregation. New Zealand has the best race relations in the world. Post-World War II, large numbers of Māori moved to cities due to economic necessity, which was seen by Europeans as Māori being attracted to the sophistication of urban life. So every wants or challenges that the colonizers and settlers faced, such as wanting Māori land for cheap or Māori moving to urban centres. So the discourses shifted and responded in ways that maintained or reinforced European worldviews and ambitions. These phenomena described by Bilara remain present in our culture, the oversimplification of issues in history, and ignorance of history, and an unrelenting accumulation at the expense and exploitation of Māori and now other marginalized communities. Finally, the base of European superiority remains. It may be less obviously present in our discourses, but it is obvious that the government and our legal systems are not based on tikanga or Māori exercising mana motuhake. Our existing power systems are in place because of the doctrine of discovery, an idea rooted in European superiority, or in other words, white supremacy. Now, I know that the term white supremacy conjures up images of individual extremists, but it is important that we recognize it as built into our country's systems and also embedded in our culture. A definition of white supremacy that articulates this is by Ansley, who states that white supremacy is a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. We need to be talking about white supremacy in this way. It is important that white supremacy can be identified and named in our broader society, and that white people like myself work to identify it in ourselves. Further, to understand its origins as just an idea and not rooted in any reality. This would be an important step in dismantling white supremacy and aiming for constitutional transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Romy. Thank you for reminding us about the history of settler colonialism and the foundation of white supremacy in this country. Our third presenter is Danny. They're currently finishing a PhD, and it's about the Tiriti workers movement, exploring an ongoing pursuit of Tiriti-based futures in Aotearoa New Zealand in solidarity with Tiroranga Tiratanga. Their presentation is on tracing the trajectory of Tiriti work in Aotearoa New Zealand. Over to you, Danny.
Hi. Kyle, tēnā koutou katoa, lama hivsha. Hello everyone. Ko Danny Pickering tōku ingoa, she Pākehā Agaskea lohanum. And I'll be spending the next few minutes sharing key findings from my PhD research on Tauiwi Tiriti work in Aotearoa, New Zealand. An idea I submitted an abstract for and then immediately regretted. How am I supposed to condense 4 years of work into 6 minutes? Why didn't I scope down to just one chapter for a Pachakacha presentation of all things? Anyway, what's done is done. I've done my best to cut the useful stuff from the academic chaff, but this will still be pretty messy, I think, so please bear with me. So my research questions are the following. How is Tauiwi non-Māori Tiriti work in Aotearoa changing and or not changing over time? And how are and aren't these changes conducive to Tiriti-based futures? And how on earth do I make this project responsive to the change of government that we just had? Firstly, some key terms and ideas. I'm loosely describing, if not defining, Tiriti work as any organized activities done to honor Te Tiriti and or to decolonize in some way within the Aotearoa context. Within this description, I'm not necessarily distinguishing between Māori and Tauiwi doing Tiriti work, though my positionality grounds me in the Pākehā side of things in particular. I'm approaching this from the discipline of social movement studies, which has helped me figure out what the more useful ways are of distinguishing between Māori and Tauiwi Tiriti movements, and the Matike Mai framework of the rangatira sphere, the Kawanatanga sphere, and the relational sphere has been useful for that because that's a way of showing that they're different movements, I guess. So for my project, I basically traveled up and down Te Ika a Maui and Te Waipounamu to interview treaty workers, both new and veteran, to get a feel of their reading of the trajectory of the movement. I then analyzed those interviews, and I'm currently producing thousands of words about that analysis that I'll now try to condense to a few hundred for you. The first thing I found was that there was very strong generational distinctions within the movement, particularly for generations 2 and 3, which loosely correspond with boomers and Generation X. At first, it was easy to understand why these distinctions mattered, because these charts of what the Tiriti workers movement was doing in previous generations looks quite different from the one that I kind of mapped out for today. So interventions with non-Māori engaging in te reo education, for example, or interventions on social media, like as collective action, not just as networking, didn't exist for previous generations, basically. I eventually realized, though, that many things that looked discontinuous with what came before actually had pretty strong genealogical links to it, hence the bracketed discontinuity framing I'm going with, which is both. So, for example, caucused organizations like Asian Supporting Tino Rangatiratanga and the Pākehā Project, while caucused organizations are arguably new, it's a practice, the caucusing itself has been going on for ages, and that slide went way too fast. The second theme covers the overlapping relational frameworks that the Tiriti workers I interviewed described using in their work. Te Tiriti itself was one of those frameworks. Basically, how do people relate to the land? But because I'm in sociology, I had to look at it through that framework as well. And sociology got really confused looking at Te Tiriti because each of these different categories, tangata whenua, tangata moana, tangata tiriti, is its own kind of type of category. So, and participants drew from all of these categories, culture, ethnicity, and race in their Tiriti work. But really importantly, they did so in that order. And I think that we see some of the consequences of that confusion in the way that race is neglected in both analysis and teaching of Tiriti relations within Pākehā Tiriti education especially. I found in both cases that most Pākehā Tiriti workers were more than happy to name racism, but were much more hesitant to engage with how race itself structures relationships between peoples in Aotearoa. Which is not to say that no Tiriti workers I spoke with weren't aware of this gap in understanding. This Pākehā participant spoke eloquently about the double bind they find themselves in while working for the Pākehā. There's a real tension here, basically, between accommodating the emotional needs of learners so that they don't get too defensive to change, and pushing them and developing their critical conscience. On the one hand, this strategy has become a bit of a tried and true tactic that's been refined over 4 generations to sometimes transformational effect. But on the other hand, when it requires a treaty educator to not name race and white supremacy in a workshop setting or another education setting, it ends up reproducing whiteness. The third theme, gosh, this is going fast, looks at the positionality of Tauiwi Tiriti work within the dominant settler group and how this positioning flies in the face of much conventional social movement theory. The convention assumes that movements and their oppositions are distinct, separate from each other. Tauiwi Tiriti workers, however, strive to recognize our own dominance and work to undermine it from within the dominant group as part of it. I would argue that the implications of this can, in some ways, be quite positive. By openly embracing a colonizer status, by working amongst the colonizing group as part of it, many participants felt that it was easier to start owning up to that complicity and then to model that behavior for others in the dominant group. On the other hand, participants in smaller towns and communities in particular found that being positioned within the dominant group, meeting peers where they're at while trying to move them, limited or foreclosed opportunities for them to participate in or organize more confrontational or arguably radical kinds of action. And much like an analysis of race could be better, so too did I find that on the whole, the movement's ability to analyze global capitalism's impact on our work was also kind of limited. While we were able to name things like the American-based Atlas Network's influence on the ACT Party's ongoing anti-Tiriti campaigning, as Arcia Tekun says about race, after this naming, the discourse falters. And while it falters, Māori continue to suffer from worse economic conditions, even as we might be making arguably some progress in cultural areas. Look, I did say that this would cover 4 themes in my analysis in the abstract. That's ridiculous. I've only managed to find time for 3. So here's some early conclusions that the movement goes on and the conditions change for each generation, but the movement effectively keeps on moving. So obviously that's all I've got time for. What a whirlwind. I hope you've enjoyed this work in progress because, oh my God, doing a PhD, super stressful. I hope that something from this can inform your Tiriti work of your own in some small way. Ngā mihi nui, papa leibris on eishteoch. Thanks for listening.
Great job in condensing your PhD in 7 minutes. Thank you for sharing with us the various forms of Tiriti work activism undertaken by different generations in Aotearoa, Danny. Our final presenter is Tui, a social worker and academic staff. Tui's presentation is on an investigation into the impact of Pākehā culture on social work practice with Māori clients, as explored by Pākehā social workers in supervision. Over to you, Tui.
Kia ora, thank you. Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Tui Armstrong tōku ingoa, no te tai toki rau ahau, he Pākehā ahau, he tangata tiriti ahau. Tēnā tātou katoa. I reckon messy is going to be the word for me. Thank you, Danny, for that, because it's hard and fast today. I'm just going to get into it. I can't see my slides moving yet, but we will be moving. So I did this research in the middle of the first lockdown that we had with 2 kids at home. So it was all just a bit buck wild at that time. So here it is. So as a Pākehā social worker myself, I saw a responsibility to research within my own culture as a way to contribute to the overall, oh, we've sped up, we're speeding up, we're going real fast. Can we back those slides up, please? I was also very aware of the invisibility of the Pākehā influence on social work and social work supervision literature, and I really wanted to respond formally to a lack of formal conversation from my people in that space. This now should be slide 3 with the arrival of mandatory registration. At that point, it was on the horizon. It's here now. I wanted to really centre in my profession. I wanted to know about social workers and what they were choosing to focus on in supervision, and especially because there's a responsibility of the supervisor to sign off on social worker competency to work with Māori, and I wanted to know what that looked like, especially when both parties to that relationship are Pākehā. I didn't ask for it, but I did get that in my participants. So the requirements for supervision for registered social workers are provided for by the Social Work Registration Board and the ANZASW, and supervision in our profession is seen as essential to safe and accountable social work practice. It's a must-have. I was very purposeful in asking for Pākehā participants and those who have been through that journey to identify as Pākehā, and we know that that can be fraught. And I also wanted to, well, in the literature review and all that stuff that you do, is that Pākehā identity should be examined in relation to issues of whiteness and white privilege, especially given the often unspoken Western value base that still permeates the social work profession, even though I think we think that we're a bit further along as social workers, we're not. We do a lot of work in social work education about this. However, part of my interest is surrounded in how those discussions continue once our social workers leave our care and into the social work profession. Māori academics, of course, have been developing kaupapa Māori principles, models and frameworks for social work supervision for decades, and the Pākehā piece of that is very silent and assumed. While we're moving quite far along, so I managed to get 4 female registered social workers as participants, got the last interview in just before we went into lockdown. All of them happened to be working in the field of social work, and all happened to have Pākehā social work supervisors at the time. That was also my identity at that time as well. I was working in health social work. And so that was really fascinating as I used a narrative inquiry approach. And I guess it's acknowledged that because I was the same, there was all of the intricacies that went on in the conversations, and that maybe participants shared a bit more because of the likeness between us. Findings, I grouped them into 3 themes. There were lots of beautiful conversations that Pākehā social workers were having in supervision. There were times where Pākehā were actively choosing not to have these conversations, and then I did ask for some reasons and suggestions as to why that might be. There were examples of supervision discussions about the impact of Pākehā culture, privilege and power on social work practice with Māori. There was also the suggestion that Pākehā culture was directly associated with the systemic power in the health system for which all participants represented. There were also examples of instances where Pākehā culture may have been implicit in supervision discussions, where both the participant and their supervisor were identified as Pākehā. And this exposes the possibility that Pākehā social workers actively silence issues experienced by and between themselves in the supervisory relationship. One participant also openly discussed her struggle with continuing to connect with her Pākehā identity in her career now. And I think that is quite common, and we do a lot of work in our social work, well, in social work education. Well, I do, I hope my colleagues are out there. And again, it is what then does that happen when they enter practice. A reason why social workers may not is that there was an acknowledgement of the power dynamic in the supervisory relationship, because the supervisors sign off on our competency to work with Māori and all of our other competencies as well. And that was really raised by a number of participants as to reasons why. Another piece in this, wow, this is going really, really fast, is that the organisation and I guess the overall environment of our profession, and then you can't not have the health system hovering in the background given where these participants came from, is that there isn't space for vulnerability to really do a deep dive and reflect on those things. The last point, which was unfortunately unsurprising to me, was that there were some suggestions that some Pākehā social workers may remain ignorant, and in fact some may actively resist or even like the power that comes with being Pākehā in this work, and therefore it's potentially just not talked about or recognised. Came up with heaps of recommendations. I'm going to power through this. So for Pākehā social workers in supervision out there, recognise the practice issues and proactively do the work, have the conversations. Have the negotiation with your supervisor around how you're going to unpack that stuff in supervision. And get over yourself and get out of your own way, please. Heaps of recommendations for social work education, because even though we do a good job, we can do a better job around creating learning opportunities for our apunga, to give them a bit of a taste of the real world, not all of this academic stuff that we try and pop into their heads and then go, good luck, see you later. Heaps of recommendations for organisations who employ social workers, like put your money where your mouth is, and let's, again, because some of the participants did identify that they lent on Māori colleagues, let's stop doing that, folks. Let's stop doing that, and let's organisations put our money where their mouths are. And I've got heaps of recommendations for education and for the board. Maybe I'll write a submission. Thank you very much. See you all in breakout room. Bye.
Thank you for sharing with us the importance of reflecting on and explicitly talking about Pākehā culture and power. Congratulations to all presenters for nailing the Pecha Kucha. That's all of the 4 Pecha Kucha section for this part of the session. The next section is 15-minute more focused discussion through breakout rooms, where attendees will have the opportunity to select the room that you wish to enter to interact with the specific presenter. I just want to give special mention to Agnes, Sonia, Becky, and Maitali, who will be playing the moderator role in the breakout room. I believe that's a community code. Yes. So some of you will be familiar with the community code. So during the discussion, just be mindful that to be respectful and to be curious and open to other people's perspective, remain confidentiality. People are speaking from their own experience, not necessarily generalizing to the whole group. I'll see you in the breakout rooms. Thank you all for engaging so actively in the breakout room session. Kanui Ngamihi for attending the Being Pākehā and Pākehā Allyship session. Our next section is on the topic of Kawanatanga, which will take place at 12:30. Meanwhile, please take a break until the next section occurs. Ka kite.